The Executioner is a choose-your-own-adventure text-based RPG by Russian indie developer Lesser Evil Games. It's buggy, the translation is spotty, and it's a strong contender for my Game of the Year. Allow me to explain. As you might expect from the title, The Executioner is a game in which you assume the role of, well, someone who violently shortens people for a living. Set in the fictional medieval city of Wien, which translated to come when I just ran it through Google, so there's that, the game depicts a nation ruled through religious dogma and state-sanctioned violence, where the judges are corrupt, the royal lineage is cursed, and the public are little more than a bloodthirsty mob looking for entertainment at the nearest gallows. In the midst of all this, you are the son of the royal executioner who, and this isn't really much of a spoiler, assumes the role after his dad gets accused of treason. A hulking great brick shithouse of a young man, your strengths lie on your capacity and willingness to inflict pain, but in turn your upbringing as a social pariah and the distant affections of your father have left you socially malformed. With this lopsided skill set, you must navigate conspiracies, court intrigue, fermenting revolution and self-discovery, with each choice splintering into multiple outcomes based on your conscious choices and the limits of the character in their own right. In many cases, these choices are presented in-game as multiple choices to conclude a scene, but they also come up in the conflict system, the one place where the game really begins to feel like an RPG. Conflict, instead of giving you predetermined choices, instead offers you a selection of paths to take to get what you want, ranging from simple persuasion to letting your axe do the talking. Each of these approaches have their own risks and outcomes, but the really evil little detail is that when you choose an option, the game tells you if it'll work or not. Then it asks you, do you want to escalate this, to take another shot? If you're persuading someone and it fails, you'll have to up the ante to threats or outright violence, but in doing so, you also lower your chances of that working. So the game is not too subtly suggesting that entering conflicts with violence is the most optimal solution. But violence also results in more severe consequences. That's what led to me accidentally murdering everyone in the pub and burning it down, but let's try to keep this spoiler free for the moment. Suffice it to say, from a mechanical standpoint, the Executioner has a limited range of interactivity, but all that's there is explicitly geared towards furthering the experience, not just providing a distraction from the text. Speaking of experience, for an RPG, while you do gain experience through your actions, the management of other parallel stats will shape the progression of the story as much as your XP or cash will. With many choices, you'll gradually influence your worldview, your views between science and occultism, your political stance, royal loyalist or revolutionary, and your moral compass, empathy or sociopathy, all of which unlock skills which provide you with ongoing benefits or situational skills that give you more options, which you will want, believe me. Taking an interest in the sciences, for example, not only opened up a lengthy subplot with a local surgeon with unknown ties to the executioner's father, but also gave me a new avenue of earning money as a barber surgeon, as well as a few options to certain situations that a less rational mind might have missed. In doing this, each choice you make feels like it has weight in the long term, as well as opening up a lot of scope for a second playthrough. In my 8 hours of play, I didn't touch either of the occult or revolutionary content, so Warlock Guy Fawkes will have to come next time, I guess. The most uncomfortable mechanic of the Executioner, the torturing and interrogation itself, is in my opinion one of its best and worst features. Naturally, in order to execute someone, you need to try and extract a confession from your subject. I mean, they're dead either way, but the mob are appeased by the ritual more than the act itself. However, the process is an inexact science. Rather than knowing your rate for success and failure up front, you instead have to balance the victim's physical and emotional well-being, keeping them teetering at the verge of breaking in order to extract the information you want to hear. On top of your victim's needs, you then need to manage your stamina, which drains with each horror you inflict, but can be restored with items or taking a rest, but that also gives your subjects a chance to recover. Then you will have to ensure your own sanity doesn't drop too far from all the horrible things you're doing to people, like burning out their eyes and lopping off limbs, which you can mitigate by trying to be a good person outside of the torture chamber, or just doing shitloads of opium. Then, you've also got a limited window of time to get all your answers by, with your assistant acting as a temporary second pair of hands when you absolutely need to rest, and Jesus, if this is what torture was like, then I kind of feel sorry for the guy with the thumbscrews, because this sounds like a logistical nightmare. My complaint comes in that with all these spinning plates in play, and no consistent metric to see what one torture does as the tolerances of victims seem to differ from case to case, I frequently found myself making massive mistakes without realising I'd taken my eye off a particular element until it was too late. Then again, I suppose that was the idea, to make the interrogation and torture as mentally taxing as possible to properly reproduce the intensity of the real thing. In which case, yeah, good job. Now, let's address the elephant in the room. This is a Russian-made indie game made by a handful of devs. The translation isn't great. To me, a seasoned veteran of incredibly badly translated Eurodrank, I only experienced a few moments of stop and read that again garbled English, but I can appreciate that when 90% of the game experience is spent reading, you want it to be legible. As of this review, Lesser Evil have publicly announced they're reaching out to UK and US translators to improve the quality of what's there, so if that's a concern, I might advise waiting until an update addresses this. What I would not advise is leaving shitty Steam reviews that crash the average review score to mix because you have unhealthy expectations of small development teams. So, why do I think this is a contender for Game of the Year? Simply put, this game made me stop playing because I was so disgusted with myself that I was on the verge of tears. I haven't had a game push me to tears since The Walking Dead, and even then I was more of a blameless, passive observer. In The Executioner, everything that led up to me quitting was 100% my fucking fault. And I don't mean in the Spec Ops The Line fault of you could have stopped playing, no. I pressed buttons that made me responsible for the outcome I saw, an outcome I had more than one avenue to avoid. I'll get into this in the more spoilery part of the review, but yeah. I've shot NPCs in the face as they begged for mercy. I've set fire to pedestrians and put them out with piss. I've done a million horrible little things in various games, but in none of them did I really feel like I'd failed myself as a human being. The Executioner is a story about a broken person expected to become a monster, and who can very easily become one. Or they can fight back, and little by little regain scraps of humanity, in spite of it all. I guess that neatly takes me over to the other reason why I might not recommend this game to everyone. The Executioner does not pull a single punch at any stage throughout the entire game. You bear witness to, as well as have the opportunity to inflict, major physical and emotional harm against other characters, much of which is described in detail, although I'll credit the Executioner, it never crosses the line into edgy for the sake of it bullshit that games such as Hatred comparatively leapt over with glee. Go into this game with your eyes open and expectations set, otherwise you're going to be in for a very nasty shock. Oh, I should probably talk about the actual look of the game. Obviously, a game which is very text-based is not necessarily going to focus too much on the graphics, but what is there is very visually striking. It's a very monotone black and white charcoal style design with splashes of colour just for effect here and there. It never felt like I was missing out on things I was trying to see in certain shots, but it always gave me a sense of framing, a sense of clarity to the events I was always conducting. Things like the portraits when you're torturing people in particular do very much drive home the idea that you are causing people intense physical harm, and the art style reflects that beautifully. Anyway, that's the spoiler-free bit done. But bugger off if you don't want to hear about the absolutely awful things I did in this game. There's a lot of them. So I'm actually going to preface this spoiler review with another sort of spoiler warning. The events I'm about to describe are all drawn from my own playthrough. While the major plot beats are most likely going to be the same no matter what, specific outcomes may be different in your playthrough, so take everything I say from here on out with a hefty dose of in my experience added. To talk properly about this game, I think I just need to walk us through it. This won't be an exhaustive recounting, but I'll try to touch on all the most important features that the game brings up. Right out of the gate, the Executioner presents itself as something of a character study. We see this world through the eyes of our unnamed protagonist, a man brought up by a father who only really connected with his son when they were inflicting terrible agony upon other people. During the tutorial for the torturing mechanic, he goads his son into inflicting various atrocities upon a thieving scribe in order to extract a false confession of treason, which we must dutifully obey. We cut him, burn him, and eventually break his will. He signs the confession. Then Father tells us to keep going. We have what we want, but Father says to keep going. To cut the scribe's arm off. I mean, he's dead anyway. I'd imagine a good amount of people would, given that this is the tutorial, would go ahead and do it. Naturally, this kills the poor fucker. You don't have to, though. I chose to let Father do the deed, if he was willing to do it. I didn't stop him, but I kept my hands relatively clean. I drew a line. Only afterwards, when I was looking at the achievements, did I realise I didn't have to torture him at all. I could have left once I knew that the confession was a lie. The executioner is rife with situations like this. Rather than just waste the player's time with good and evil choices, it instead presents you with a situation and then watches to see how you'll react. An excellent example of this is the relationship that grows between the executioner and the assistant, a wizened old man who helped his father in his duties in the hope of one day taking up the role. Treated like shit, dirt poor, and mistreated by your father, my immediate instinct was to try and be nice to the old guy. I gave him a fair cut of my wages as a headsman, split the take from selling bodies, and even shared my food. But he never once thanked me. He seemed habitually predisposed to see the world as his enemy, no matter what I did to help him. Over time, I began to understand why the executioner's father had hated the assistant. The man was a fucking psychopath, if not a sadist. Whenever I delegated a task to the old man, he'd do his best to wield whatever meagre power he had over anyone nearby, leading to the tipping point whereupon I realised that all my good intentions hadn't helped some poor old man, but instead enabled a violent little shit to act out his cruel power trip on innocent people. As an executioner, you get a few perks on the job. Beyond the legal right to sell corpses to whoever you please, you can take a tithe of fresh food from the market, and, remember this for later, even take a condemned woman's hand in marriage to spare her from the gallows. When I did it, I only took the odd bit of fresh meat to help me recover more health and stamina each night when I came home to rest and level up. When the assistant did it, he nearly beat someone to death over a pie. I'll say it right now, I am really looking forward to getting this evil little squid under my knife at some point down the road. The moral ambiguity in this game is handled exceptionally well. There were perhaps only a few objectively evil choices that I could make throughout the first episode, and even then they never really felt out of character for the person I was playing. Being brought up to respect threats and the results that violence can bring, the executioner initially has no other tools at his disposal. He's more than a little bit broken. Even when I chose options that felt like they were the kindest or least harmful, the ingrained streak of violence would always surface, colouring my pure intentions with a little dash of scarlet as I broke bones when a closed fist would have done, or even hurt people I cared about in order to save them from a worse outcome. I suppose this is why I enjoyed the game so much. You aren't a player using the executioner as an avatar. You're more like some atrophied part of this man's mind, trying to steer him in one direction or another, but still limited by what you can accomplish. You can't just be good. You can only try, then fail, then try again. In doing so, the moments of objective good shine out as genuine victories, while the lapses in judgment feel unpleasantly familiar to anyone who's had their willpower give out from under them. This questioning of objective good and evil extends throughout the plot, especially during the main thread regarding the reasons behind your father's execution for treason. Multiple factions are at play, all vying for control of Vian in various ways. The seething revolutionary underclasses, aristocrats seeking a shift in the way that the kingdom is ruled through practical philosophy, as well as those already in power looking to keep their base in check. The same can be said for the balance between superstition and science. During my exploration of the more scientific plot thread, I discovered an illegal medical school situated in a slaughterhouse, on the one hand providing safe haven for scientists who might be branded as heretics elsewhere, while at the same time struggling to dismiss old superstitions still rife within the workforce. I personally really like the characters I met, the jovial intellectual of the surgeon, the mildly shifty but endearing Ifrit, as well as the ragtag bunch of mildly insane slaughterhouse workers who may or may not be part of some weird blood cult. I'm just saying, layers bro. While the core intrigue and intellectual development played a more overarching part in the gameplay, the real meat of Episode 1 lay within a different investigation. The first victim to undergo my knife in my new role as executioner was a gamekeeper. The game doesn't bother with real names, just go with it. Who had been accused of poaching. We extracted all the information I needed, taking a little moment of sick pride in not causing any lasting damage to the man, then sent him for a short dance on thin air. I chose a long drop, a quicker and more merciful method of death that sat better with my conscience, but riled up the crowd who had been expecting more of a spectacle. Already I was considering taking the body to the surgeon as soon as possible, as his introduction had piqued my interest in the sciences. It was only the following morning, as the cash was in my hand, that the gamekeeper's daughter, the maid, arrived at my door. She was here to collect the body. Whoops. Through careful conversation and tactical evasion of the truth, she eventually revealed that she'd expected as such. She didn't have the money for the body, but had been willing to trade her grandmother's old cottage. Naturally, since being a landlord would make me one of them, I decided to refuse, but took up her request to investigate the scene of the crime. She believed her father was innocent. And she was right. This began a chain of escalating situations where the executioner and the maid set about picking apart a conspiracy that had led to her father's framing for a crime he didn't commit. At every step, the thought weighed in my mind of what I had done to that man, whether or not my mercifully brief manner of death was any comfort. If she hadn't forgiven me, she was at least practically minded enough to accept what had happened and move on in order to get to the truth. Unfortunately, the path to the truth wasn't an easy one. As I mentioned earlier, a visit to the pub in a poorer part of town resulted in a conflict that escalated past the point of return. The executioner's vision went red. Only glimpses of what happened next were described. Severed heads in the brazier, a tip of a spear entering my side, screams from fire-drenched windows as the whole building was consumed. In any other game it might have felt cathartic. It just felt empty. How could I justify what I was doing if more innocent people got caught in the crossfire? I wasn't sure if I could. Later on, probably my darkest moment, I encountered the orphan. A 7-year-old girl, found amidst the bodies of her parents, accused not only of murder, but witchcraft, the church believing that no child could have done this without the help of Satan himself. I was given a choice: conduct the interrogation myself, or let the assistant handle it. Now, let that sink in. Would you rather beat and cut a confession out of a child, or let a man you'd hardly trust with a gerbil do it instead? Either way, a priest would oversee the session to ensure the girl didn't suffer too much, a note that made me want to reach through the screen and strangle the pious fuck myself. So I bit the bullet and took the responsibility upon myself. I went too far. I stopped playing. I felt like a horrible piece of shit. That's when the lesson from the beginning came back to me. I'd done what I was told. I'd extracted a confession that had been obviously coached to justify a cruel and pointless act of even further cruelty. I hadn't even considered what else I could have done. Taking advantage of the game over I'd gotten from losing too much sanity, I repeated the same day, only this time, once I began the interrogation, I did such token levels of torture that it looked more like a firmly washed face and a timeout, then concluded the session. I like to imagine the executioner conducting a great deal of woogie-boogie theatre as he applied the dreaded cold flannel to the orphan's face before turning to the priest and saying, "Ah, damn, she resisted the scrub chops. Nothing more I can do today. Sorry," and fucking off for the night. However, the girl still had an appointment with the pyre. She would be burned as a witch, with or without a confession. Which is why, when I began the following day with the dark thought in my head of how little suffering I could possibly inflict, I was shocked to see a third option. She was a woman. She was condemned to die. I had the right to marry her. So that's how I got a child bride. Naturally, the executioner, as did I, considered this to be more of an adoption or an apprenticeship rather than the intensely creepy and unpleasant implications that I imagine some people might have drawn. Indeed, as if the game knew I wanted to clarify my position, the same priest later visited the executioner's house to advise him on consummating the union. I have never chosen to physically assault a priest so fast in my entire life. So, with my arse on the church's shit list, an adopted daughter/wife who might be a multiple murderer or witch with more than a few innocent deaths on my conscience, I got on with the rest of my day. Oh shit, I didn't even mention the dog. You can adopt a dog in this game. I might have fed it a bit of the gamekeeper in order to lure it out. He's a good boy and I love him. I feel like the found family reading of this game would be very interesting to hear at some point. Anyway, without making this recounting take as long as the game itself, let's accelerate to the conclusion of the story. Through deals with shady criminal figures, we finally determined that the culprit responsible for the gamekeeper's frame-up was none other than his brother, the maid's uncle. In a fit of drunken envy, he set up the gamekeeper to take the fall so the brother could take his place. Only that fell apart the minute the confession was signed. A new gamekeeper had already moved in, and the brother, torn apart by fear and guilt, had fallen into hiding as a paranoid wreck. When our confrontation had concluded, when I had the man under my knife, the maid begged for him to be spared. Even as a player, I wasn't sure if this fucker deserved to live another minute, let alone receive mercy. But once I had his confession, I realised that the game had set this all up in order to ask the most pervasive question. Could I, alone, really dispense any kind of justice? The courts are corrupt. Their methods serve themselves, not the people. The executioner is just the grinder that people are fed into. But here, beyond their control, was I any better than them? Was my judgment any more valid than theirs? The damage had already been done. Killing him wouldn't undo anything that had already been done, or change anything to come. So I let him go. The maid was in pieces. Her family had turned on itself, and any hope of catharsis had been stolen from her. Over the last few hours, I'd had questions rolling around in my head, and now, finally, I had an answer that might actually help someone. We can't rely on dogma and law to give our actions meaning. That's down to us. It wasn't perfect, but she was able to get up and, I hope, move on. I'd done something, finally, objectively good. I'd fucked up, failed at every possible point, but I'd kept trying and managed to succeed. It felt amazing. So yeah, game of the fucking year. Peace.